Hello, International Relations class. We're going to take up Chapter 9 in the Bova text, Global Futures, and talking about basically how you view and what you think will happen in international relations moving forward. Kind of an interesting time to be thinking about this, given this global pandemic. How is that going to have an effect on the world? I personally think that this is going to change a lot of things for us moving forward. It's been very disruptive, obviously. We're in today's day one of the official state of Michigan lockdown. I've lived for 53 years and I can say I've never experienced anything like that, and we're gonna have all kinds of stories to tell. So anyway, let's begin talking about this. We're in the PowerPoint here for Chapter 9. Again, I'll be sending this to you. If you look at Slide 6, you can see kind of the two different visions out there. Okay, there's a couple of quotes. Peter Singer basically is a globalist, thinks there's going to be some form of one world government in the future. He says now that the 21st century faces the task of developing a suitable form of government for that single world, it's a daunting moral and intellectual challenge, but one we cannot refuse to take up. So he seems to think you could have some form of one world government. I don't know what your thoughts on that. I have my own personal opinions that are strong about that. It's just kind of interesting. And then Stanley Michalak in 2001 said something different. He said, as optimists, we like to think that solutions exist out there. New ideas that once discovered could usher in a new era of peace and amity. The truth is, none exists. So Peter Singer is kind of have a positive view of a one world government. We can kind of fix everything. Michalak is basically more of a skeptist. He's skeptical. He thinks that, listen, that you're not going. Doesn't matter what you do, doesn't matter what we do, we're not going to create a situation of global peace. And so let's look at the different paradigms here. If you look at slide number 8, you can see the various visions of the future, and you need to think a little bit about perhaps what you think might happen in the global future. There's this idea of the argument of the end of history. We'll talk about one world, a world state, a time when war becomes unthinkable, an engendered peace, a clash of civilizations, or some form of great power war. Okay, so again, pick your paradigm, pick your vision. Which one do you think most accurately comports with reality? Again, if you remember, we talked about this one of the first few weeks of this class. One of the tests of a worldview as to whether or not it's really true is, does it fit with reality? It's just like a map. If you have a map of a city or something like that, and you follow that map and you keep falling off of cliffs or running into walls or running into waterfalls or things like that, following this map, you realize, you know what? It claims to be a map of reality, but honestly, it's not really showing me an accurate way to go. In other words, the true test of a map, does it reflect the topography, the geography of what is really, really there? Same is true of a paradigm. Okay, that might help you a little bit. So let's talk about the first one. Go to slide number 9, talking about the end of history. And basically the vision is something, again, Francis Fukuyama advanced this at the end of the Cold War. And his logic was not that it's all going to be sunshine and lollipops, but rather that, listen, communism has been exposed for the fraud that it is, and that the democratic liberal view of governance has been shown to lead to the greatest degree of human flourishing. And so more and more countries are going to begin to adopt that. And then, of course, you follow the Kantian triangle logic. And basically, we're kind of at an end of history in the sense that there's no great political theories that are going to be advanced that are going to take us any farther. We've kind of found the solution in the form of some form of democratic governance with liberal democracies and things of that nature. Okay, so they look at the third wave of democracy in areas like Southern Europe, Latin America, Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. There's no more Cold War. Free market capitalism is dominating. And so, again, it's an optimistic view of history. I don't want to get into this too deeply, but Fukuyama basically felt that there would be just a general sense of stasis. Okay, the idea that things are going to freeze in the sense that there's not going to be great turbulence. Now, the pushback is, a lot of other countries are still in history. Okay, you take Islamic countries, where again, if you remember, the idea of democracy, rule by the people, popular sovereignty, the voice of the people is the voice of God. That's this idea of popular sovereignty. To a Muslim, that is blasphemy. So in other words, the idea of democracy, the voice of the people is the voice of God, goes down like a rat sandwich in that kind of culture. So they're still in history. There's still issues there, okay? And then basically this Arab Spring that kicked in a lot of these Middle Eastern countries, like Egypt and Libya, basically they have broken down. And so the logic of Fukuyama has been found wanting. Other arguments that perhaps we've reached the end of history, within this argument, they look at China. They look at some of the modernization going on in China, where economic development occurs and a more educated and middle-class population emerges. And so now more and more people become involved in the democratic process. Again, the thinking is China is going to democratize completely, and it's going to be a much more peaceful country. Now, we've talked about this in class, that China is not the paragon of virtue that many think that it has become. Again, this coronavirus outbreak and what we're hearing, stories we're hearing now about their suppression of the press, their suppression of scientists and medical experts that basically had a cure, and different things like that is revealing that again, for all of the utopian visions of what China could become, and again, they have embraced a lot of free market capitalism, but then their political system is still communistic at its core. That can be a problem. But again, the vision of the end of history is if you reach a critical mass of democratic countries, one of which surely should be China, you can get to a place where basically there's peace. So what are some of the critiques of the end of history? If you look at slide number 11, is the transitions to democracy, while obviously welcomed, also are very unstable. When a nation is transitioning towards democracy, basically there's all kinds of power vacuums going on and different groups that start arising. And so in that instability, wars could break out. Another critique is that a lot of countries are not democratic and are not showing signs of becoming purely democratic in the future, such as China, the Middle East, and parts of Asia and Africa. And then you've got authoritarian backsliding, like in Russia, where again, I'm trying to remember, it was just in the news last week, this all gets swallowed up by the coronavirus, but I believe they had, the legislature of Russia basically voted Putin in for, I think, throughout the 2020s. In other words, this guy's becoming very quickly at least a dictator, an elective dictator. Okay, so in other words, this backsliding that's happening in Russia is indicating that perhaps this idea of the end of history is not quite the sunshine that they think it might be. Okay, and you can look at some of these other areas there. You've got Muslims in the region that associate democracy with what is unjust. In other words, they see American imposition of democracy on these countries like Iraq as a big problem. If you move on here to slide number 12, you can see the vision of one world. Okay, this idea that basically because of economic globalization, that is going to bring the world together. In other words, it's going to transcend culture. It's going to transcend politics. It's going to transcend tradition. It's going to transcend religion. Okay, this idea that, again, if all these nations are so economically interconnected, globalization is going to lead to McDonaldization. Okay, in other words, and so we're going to be basically this one world market. Okay, and it's going to yield to some form of global peace. And it's going to prevent the emergence of a new type of Cold War. And so the vision is that, listen, since we're so economically interconnected, nations are not going to do anything that's bad for business. Anything that's going to undercut global prosperity, nations are not going to do that. Okay, now, again, throw in the wrench of this coronavirus and you can see some of the weaknesses that arise in some of these paradigms. Are nations doing things right now that are bad for business? Yeah, what the United States is doing right now is very, very bad for business. Again, rightfully so. You're trying to save lives. Are other countries doing the same thing? Yes, okay. But again, the logic of one world, absent what they call a black swan event, which is exactly what this coronavirus is, nations would not do anything to harm the economy. And so because of this economic interdependence, it trumps outmoded notions of, rejecting, political objections to those types of things. If you look over to slide number 15, you can see some of the critiques of this one world. The reference here is to a book written in 1910 called The Great Illusion. In other words, this argument is war is just an illusion. Okay, again, what's the irony of that book written in 1910? What happened 4 years later? World War. Okay, the flaws are, again, the logic that global integration makes wars unthinkable. Okay, the problem is it makes an assumption that globally we're totally integrated. Okay, are we greatly integrated? Yes. Are we globally totally integrated? No. Another pushback is that it assumes that humans are rational. Okay, and that, in other words, one of the principles we've talked about throughout this class is in international relations, leaders and nations have incomplete information. They don't see everything, so many times they make decisions based on what they think is really real, and they have incomplete information and they make mistakes. In other words, wars could happen that way. Another logic, or another problem with the one world logic is that they think that humans are basically economic creatures. Okay, Homo economicus. Okay, this idea that we're motivated first and foremost by economic comfort, and so the thinking is we will sacrifice liberty, our way of life, our government, our civil rights, our civil liberties, our Bill of Rights. We'll sacrifice national sovereignty. We'll sacrifice national pride. We'll sacrifice our religious values so that we can be one world. Okay, in other words, that's the logic. That's the pushback. Is listen. Is what does it mean to be human? Are we primarily materialistic creatures? I shop, therefore I am. Or is there something higher than this natural world? Remember, I talked about this in one of the last lectures in chapter 7. This is exactly Winston Churchill's argument. He said, no material progress, no matter how much it benefits humans, can satisfy the human heart. Their hearts will ache, their lives will be barren when people have a vision that is no higher than material things. In other words, is there something higher than the market? The one world logic says yes, or it says basically no. There's nothing higher than the market. There's nothing higher than this material world. I shop, therefore I am. In other words, if people have stuff, if people have lots of stuff, if people have lots of comfort, that will keep people, if you want to say it, fat, dumb, and happy. Okay, it'll create this global peace. And again, the pushback is, listen, humans are made for something higher than simply material satisfaction. What about the human soul? What about man's religious needs? What about things like that? Isn't that something that's higher than this world? Okay. Another pushback you see there is the Great Recession of 2008. It basically begins to cause nations to sever global ties. That's exactly what happened in the 1930s. You had this Great Depression where nations started turning inward. Okay, remember we talked about the beggar thy neighbor policies, where America and other countries imposed high tariffs on other countries, protecting the nation. In other words, this idea of one nation, one global world tied because of economics. If a wrench is thrown in the economic machine, it messes everything up. Okay, fast forward to 2020, this coronavirus outbreak and this crisis that's global. Okay, does that throw a wrench in the logic of one world? I think we're going to find that out. I think the American economy has been severely impacted by this. I think world economies have been severely impacted by this. Okay, so in other words, the logic of, hey, listen, as long as economically things are fine, we're going to be all united. Well, I think we're going to find right now that the economy is not going to be fine, and it's going to cause nations to start turning inward to protect themselves in the midst of this. Again, interesting argument, and you can, again, this would be great if we were actually here in person. We could kind of talk about these things and debate some of these issues. I think these are fascinating. But that's it for now, so I will begin next time on slide 16, a world state.